Most of us would like to be there in person, but pandemic's gonna pandemic. So the topic is indeed, am I reading legitimate science? And before I describe the details of the panel and then have the panelists introduce themselves, just a few reminders. As you saw when you came in, this is being recorded. I should point out that chats are, if I understand correctly, chats are also recorded as part of the Zoom process. So keep it clean, at least, a PG-13 clean. Also, this is a Zoom webinar and not one of those Zoom meetings that we've been doing, all of us, for the last several months. The distinction here is that you have a function along the bottom that's Q&A. And the preference is if you're going to ask a question that you want the hosts to answer, put it in the Q&A and we will get to it. You can start loading them up. We intend to mostly deal with the Q&A section towards the end, but you could load your questions up earlier on. That's fine. Chat is fine, but we'll probably miss a question there. If you wanted to have her discuss amongst yourselves, chat's good. So very briefly, the text of our idea behind this panel is news about scientific discoveries and advances can be incredibly important and exciting, but also potentially prone to misrepresentation, misreporting, or distortion. What should readers look for before deciding to forward on a news piece to their family, friends, and colleagues? What can scientists do to ensure that their findings are reported on clearly and accurately? And what can science writers do to ensure they are reporting on solid and meaningful results? What are the signs that the underlying science itself is suspect? And how can you check when the primary literature is often paywalled? So that's our charge. Our panelists will introduce, I'll have us go through. I'll introduce myself last. We'll go alphabetical by last name. This is one of those issues that in a real panel, a physical in-person panel, we would be able to go up and down the table, but everyone's order is different on their screen. So Douglas, do you want to introduce yourself, your background, and your interest in this subject?
Sure. So thank you. So my name is Doug Dluzen. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Morgan State University in Baltimore. I study how social determinants of health, including living in poverty, influence our immune system and can then ultimately predispose us to cardiovascular diseases and other types of long-term health consequences from living in chronic stress and in the interaction with the environment. So I've studied that in aging in my training, and I'm a geneticist that does my work. I'm interested in science communication, and I write a lot of nonfiction for a general audience, especially explaining science. So I have articles in Clark's World and Analog that kind of dive into specific topics in genetics and discuss the representation in literature. So I'm very interested and passionate about making sure that science is communicated correctly, including the pros of what the new study is about and the cons.
Great. And let me see if I remember my alphabet. Sandy looks like will be next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Sandy Gibbons. You'll find me published under Henry Gibbons. I'm a scientist, and I'm basically a pure scientist on the applied side. I work for the Army in biodefense. I work for the Combat Capabilities Development Command Chemical Biological Center, formerly the Edgewood Chemical Biological Center. So obviously for the work that we do, which is defense, we can call it defense against the dark arts in a way. It is very subject to this kind of distortion and that sort of thing. So I'm very, very concerned. When I write something, I publish it in the scientific literature, and I want to make sure that I'm trying to communicate the results of what we do, and be sensitive to all of the public affairs concerns for that. And so that's where I'm coming to this. But it's also of real concern, and it has real consequences when especially now in this pandemic, as you mentioned before the talk earlier, that the science is communicated effectively, that the details are not completely glossed over, and the nuance is preserved. because this has real consequences for people's behavior.
Great. Okay then, Hanna, if you could introduce yourself and your interest in the topic.
Hi, so I'm Anna Kashina. I'm in my day job, I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I study biochemistry and protein regulation. In my other life, I'm also a fantasy author. So that has nothing to do with science communication. So occasionally in my work, I do make some discoveries which are considered newsworthy. So I had several news pieces written about my work, and it has been stunning to me how you talk to a person who's like a science writer for a publication, and then the piece comes back to you, and it kind of has nothing to do with what I did. So I think science communication interests me not only because, like, when you read science in the news, it's a big issue how accurate it is, but also there's this big disconnect between scientist language and the public language, and I think this disconnect is kind of what's hurting both science and public. So to me, it's kind of a very interesting topic to how to communicate science effectively and accurately. So during the pandemics, I've been following the news like everyone else, and occasionally my friends and relatives come back to me to ask, like, is this true or not? And I have been stunned by, like, so there are a lot of accurate discoveries there. There's also a lot of news gimmicks, and it's kind of just like this big jumble. And I'm sure we've all been reading it, and yeah, some of the things we don't know how to believe, like what is true. So yeah, so I'm interested in this topic from both sides of the scale, I guess. Yeah.
Great. So Ted.
Hi, I'm Ted Weber. I'm a speculative fiction author, which is why I come to Balticons. I'll post my website in the chat. But I'm also an ecologist with degrees in systems and wetland ecology. I've worked in forest and wildlife ecology quite a bit. I'm currently working on climate adaptation for defenders of wildlife, especially for endangered species. There's so much misinformation in the media, and even more so, magnitudes more so in social media about climate change and just science in general, that it'll take me lifetimes to list. So hoping people are tuning in to this webinar, this panel, and maybe we can talk about some of these issues.
Great. So I'm Dr. Tom Holtz. I am a vertebrate paleontologist and principal lecturer at the Department of Geology at the University of Maryland in College Park, and a research associate at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And so my interest in this topic comes from a couple different directions. One, dinosaurs which are my particular specialty within paleontology, are obviously in the public eye a lot. And so I witness a lot of science communication. I talk with a lot of reporters about other people's work as well as my own. And just the last couple of weeks had a paper come out, and interesting to see both the news media and social media totally miss the point of the paper or spin it in a different direction than the paper was actually about. Also, I do a lot of undergraduate education, and part of that has to do with science communication and being an intelligent consumer of science news and what is science versus not science. So when this topic came up, like the other panelists here, I thought this was a really interesting thing to participate in. So I think the first question that will go around, and this time we'll do it alphabetical by first name, will be an example, recent or past.
Oh, I'm still last.
What's that?
I'm still last.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. Well, we'll do reverse at some point. Here we go.
Well, at least you know your alphabet as well. I'm just scrambling to see
An example of some information in science, maybe your own research, maybe some other topic that got miscommunicated in either the news media or social media or both. So it looks like Anna will be up first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so since my mind revolves around coronavirus, so coronavirus testing was one big thing that got miscommunicated, I think, and the coronavirus origins also. So like, I mean, the story about it originating from the lab and being a biological weapon and all of this stuff. So my impression, like in this current situation, so news reporters are just picking up whatever will make the news, and they don't care if it's true or not, basically, and they just put it out there. So it's like ridiculous on so many levels to call it like a biological weapon or something created in the lab, just because it's like everything biological weapon is not. But yeah, so it got, I mean, I've seen a lot of news stories about this. I was kind of appalled by them, but there's apparently a lot of people who still believe that, and people who propagate it for their gain. So the other thing is like the coronavirus testing. So I think it recently started coming out. So first, like, we're not testing enough to say how many cases we have. And second, yeah, we're using different tests, but they're being apparently, as I learned recently, piled up into the same pool. So we basically, like, all of this eventually amounts to like zero actual information about the virus. And I think, yeah, these two are big examples which are not only glaring right now, but also very harmful. So, yeah.
Great. So, Doug.
Yeah, so I'm a trained geneticist. I think sort of related to my work, but more in general, two things I see a lot that are misrepresented in the news, and then people that want to take, you know, kind of a more of a nefarious angle to it. It frustrates me. So in the field of genetics, a core part of the history of the field is eugenics, and a lot of even just experiments from like Nazism and stuff that are now seeded back into the story of science a little bit. And you know, one thing that I like to communicate a lot about, and I get upset when reporters report incorrectly, is the idea that like we have different genes. So it'll be like, you know, this person has this gene, that person has this gene, and that's just not the case. We're all human. We all have the same genes. That's what makes us human. If we had different genes, we would be a wholly different species, and we wouldn't be able to reproduce as humans. So what the misconception is that it's not the genes that are different, it's that people have different versions of the same gene. So versions for skin color, eye color, hair length, height, those kind of things. We all have the genes that are capable of producing these proteins. It's just that variants in those proteins and their functionality give us all our unique, awesome traits. And so I see that a lot in reporting, that people are saying like they discovered this new gene in this group of people. It's like, no, it's just a new version of that gene that we'd never identified before. It's a subtle difference, but I feel it's very important when people start saying like, well, they don't have the genes that I do, and some of the really weird things I've seen online. And I'll leave it at that for now, but that's something that really grinds my gears a little bit, to quote Family Guy, that you know, people are saying that like we have different genes, and it's just all our beautiful variation that gives us our uniqueness, and that we all everyone in this room, everyone around the world, we all have the same genes. There's no one that has a different gene than anyone else.
Yeah.
Great. Now, using either name, Sandy or Henry, it looks like you're next.
Okay, yeah, I agree with Anna's assessment that there's just a ton of garbage information floating around about the coronavirus. And one particular example that sticks out for me is the reporting of, you know, and I'm a singer, so it's very, very important to what I do in my off time. But the idea that this expulsion, or the seeding of the air with particles by people who are breathing in and out and coughing and singing and talking, and that these particles, and with virus, last forever, or last 14 minutes, or whatever the half-life is of the particles is measured to be. What's lost in the reporting for that is the idea, and I've seen this on social media, is that yes, the particles last, but that is not the same as saying that the viruses within those particles are viable at the time, you know, at a certain point of time. Much less if you get to do this out in the bright sunlight, which is inimical to airborne organisms, going in with data going back to the 1940s or 50s, you have a very different scenario outdoors versus indoors, and that nuance is utterly lost in a lot of the popular reporting. And that said, to my knowledge, there's not a lot of data on this period for this virus. It's still very much in its infancy right now, and we're trying to play catch up as a scientific community with this. scientists, we have to be very cautious about how we report, and then to see this spun in 50 million ways 6 way to Sunday is it can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
Great. Now, Ted.
Well, one thing that really bothers me is people who so there's, I guess, levels of misinformation. So going from scientific papers to the popular press, some information is lost or distorted. And then going from the popular press to social media, much more is lost or distorted. And a lot of people will just read the title of an article and then just share it without actually reading the article. And then they'll make memes out of it. And so titles are intended to draw in readers, and a lot of them are clickbait. So they're intentionally exaggerated and often completely untrue. And the titles are created by editors in a paper or a magazine, not the reporter. So they may not have very little to do with the actual content of the article. So for God's sake, read the article before you share it. So here's an example of all that. So the Daily Mail in the UK, which I'm just going to go out and say it's kind of a rag, published an article on May 14 about entering a solar minimum. So meaning surface activity in the sun's reached it's at a low point. So the surface activity in the sun undergoes like an 11-year cycle, small ups and downs. So what was the title in the Daily Mail about this fact? The sun's gone into lockdown. Reduced activity in the solar surface has sparked fears of a doomsday mini ice age. So, so that's quite an alarming title, isn't it? Run, hide. So reading the actual article, so most of the article is about all these alarmist things. At the very end of the article quotes scientists saying, the effect on Earth is minuscule. But before that, it's full of sensational speculations like, are we entering another mini ice age? So I went to nasa.gov where they had a blog article, refuting this, saying there is no impending mini ice age. And so this article then had links to data showing the irradiance from the sun's 11-year cycle of small ups and downs. And this year is no different from any other low this century. So that kind of shows in a nutshell how, first of all, you should read past the title and then read to the end. A lot of times they'll post quotes from scientists towards the end, and you can harbor maybe a little bit of what's actually going on, and then go ahead and check an independent scientific source that where you can find out maybe the truth of what's going on.
Great. I just note here we've got a bunch of good questions piling up in the Q&A. We'll get to them in a bit. I do want to answer the question I asked myself. This one is sort of near and dear to my heart because it's recent and it has to do with one of my own papers. And that was one issue is that both the news media and social media tend to want to put studies into an existing narrative that they then want to say something new about. So I had a paper that was out a week or two ago on locomotion in carnivorous dinosaurs. And the thrust of the paper was looking at what benefits do longer limb size, how longer leg size have dinosaurs of different size. And we showed in our modeling that in small bodies, you increase the limb length and you get a a really positive advantage in terms of speed, but in large body size, a longer limb length doesn't add that much to speed, but it does help cut the cost of locomotion. And so the general thrust of it is little guys, longer legs for sprinting, big guys, longer legs for marathoning. But because there's already the existing narrative of did T-Rex run, yes or no, a lot of the news media and a lot of the social media was, oh, you guys have shown that Tyrannosaurus didn't run. And we didn't say anything of that sort. We didn't really address maximal speed at all. We were looking at what is the selective advantage to increasing limb length. But because people wanted the answer to the other question that we weren't asking, they would rather talk about that. And that is an issue that comes up a lot. Yeah. So I think we can go to one of the Q&A questions, and then I'll go back to some of the ones that are in our charge. And here's a specific one, and anyone who wants to address it can go ahead. How can lay people interpret preprint studies, which we've seen a lot of links to with regard to the coronavirus? This is being something relatively new to the general public. So if anyone wants to address that, you can raise your hand and go for it. Go for it, Doug.
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and really I think one that, at least in the biomedical community, we're really grappling with at the moment. So there are several different preprint archives. There's the archive. There's bioarchive, where a lot of biological information is posted. I have had a paper preprint in bioarchive, and then there's the med archive, which is similar to bioarchive, but it's for the protection of the patients and the human subjects in that research. And so that really is for research that has like human tissue samples, human subjects related to it. The preprint service was really put together to help with reproducibility issues. And the idea was that you could get your paper out there. And one of it was professionally, you get a number called a DOI number, digital object identifier number, that you could put in your grant to submit to the NIH or the NSF to say like, hey, look, I'm productive with my research. This is a preprint, but I have an official way of citing that information now. Because usually you have to wait a year sometimes to get your paper back from peer review. And then if you're pulling up for a grant, it's really hard to be like, well, I've been productive. I'm just waiting to get this accepted. But once it's in preprint now, a lot of these newspapers are citing this as fact. And a lot of it is that the idea was you put up your paper, you could get comments from the public while it's in review to strengthen the paper. Most people now are citing this as like, this is bona fide science, and any paper in a peer review database has not been, or I'm sorry, a preprint database has not been peer reviewed yet, or is in the process of being peer reviewed, which means that anybody can post anything in there. There's an initial screening to make sure you meet some criteria, but it's not something that's now been published in Science or whatever journal it is that has 4 or 5 authors, usually people within the field, maybe even competitors in that field, reading through very detailed, giving good notes, strengthening the paper, or rejecting it. And so none of that is there with the preprints. There is a lot of commentary sometimes in some papers, especially with the COVID papers, that kind of help screen that a little bit. But people are now posting like news articles, breakthroughs in these science. And a lot of times, a lot of people now are finding that there's significant flaws in these papers, and none of that's being reported. So it's a thing that the field is using to increase reproducibility, but it's social media has taken that, and media has taken that and kind of disconnected the two and inserted itself in between to say, hey, we're going to talk about it as if it's published science already. And it just isn't yet.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I see Anna had her hand up as well. So
yeah, so I kind of wanted to point out, so unfortunately, everything is correct. So the preprint service has not been peer reviewed. Unfortunately, this problem doesn't end with peer review, because peer reviewed from there means that 2 or 3 experts in the field have looked at it, sometimes not very carefully, sometimes they're not the best experts. And even the published papers have to be taken with this kind of scrutiny. So a lot of respectable scientists right now post their papers on bioarchive for all the reasons that Doug mentioned. There are also some bad papers out there. Unfortunately, some of these papers will also make it through peer review. So this problem exists at all levels. So I would say that And yeah, some papers at bioarchives, I think, get removed eventually because there's so much backlash and there's not enough proof. Ultimately, posting a paper on bioarchive doesn't give you any formal scientific credit. So most of the serious scientists do it because they want to kind of show that they were the first to make this discovery, basically. Biggest reason to post it on preprint service. So I would say that, yeah, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it doesn't mean that papers published even in such journals as Nature and Science are immune to this kind of approach. Yeah.
Absolutely. I noticed. Okay. Oh, Ted, do you want to say something?
Yeah, you can't. My hand like disappears and appears.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, I agree with Doug and Anna about both preprints might not necessarily standing up to muster, and also some published papers having problems. But that's just the nature of science. It's an evolving body of knowledge, and it changes. Knowledge changes all the time. Hopefully, in a better sense. But on the other hand, during crises like coronavirus, it's important to get information out and not wait a year or 2 years for that information to get out. Like having published and reviewed a lot of papers, it takes time. And then, but also, yeah, they can change quite a bit between that first draft and then what's finally published. But either way, I think the solution is kind of to not just look at one paper, kind of look at the body of knowledge. And so a lot of times letters will be published in response to an article in a journal, and in response, the authors will usually respond to that, and then other studies are done. So don't just look at one article and say, hey, that supports what I'm thinking, I'm going to go run with it. Or this doesn't support what I'm thinking, I'm going to look elsewhere. So just be honest and look at the body of evidence. I guess that's my advice.
Yeah, that's. I'll just chime in here. That's what most of us do anyway. When as scientists, we go in and we're digging in the literature. We're not cherry picking. We have to look at, and before we waste time in the laboratory, we make sure that we're going to pursue something that actually has a potential lead. And so we look at the body of evidence, as you said.
But you have to say, so in science also, the amount of literature right now is so overwhelming that a lot of people are guilty of this, like you just read the title or the abstract, and then you assume this has been shown already. And then, so I've done this before, revisit the fields which are supposed to be well studied and look at the actual evidence. Very often the field has nothing to do with our understanding of this field. And I think right now, like, people are revisiting old fields. And with coronavirus, yeah, you just grab like the headline. You don't know. I mean, there's no time to evaluate all this data. It's just like piling up right now. So yeah.
That's why meta studies are so popular. You know, going and looking at a whole suite of studies and pulling out the ones that are, you know, defensible. You know, like that they used like double blind, like they use experiments or data or so forth. And
yeah, so this has been great so far. I'm trying to make sure that we get some of the important questions. Not that these were unimportant questions, but sort of one of the key questions that both we had in our charge and that Beth Kingsley asked in the questions here. Is, do the panelists have thoughts on how specifically a non-scientist media consumer can assess that we're reading what we're reading, especially in the context of something like the current pandemic, where the data is limited and the science is still evolving, which relates to sort of the general, what should readers look for before deciding to forward on a news piece to their family, friends, and colleagues. So I'm sure we all have something to say about that. But we can go around and answer how we would approach this. And then we'll do a follow-up question that someone asked, which was a Are there particular publications that one should look for that do a good job of science reporting versus others? But we'll start with what are the things we should look for in an article, especially if you're a non-scientist? And so whoever wants to take that first can start, and we can just go around.
Oh, I can start.
Okay, Anna, you can go ahead. Sorry,
yeah. So yes, I think the first thing is to see if this article is citing legitimate scientific sources. And the sources would be like scientific journals, which are peer-reviewed rather than other media outlets. So obviously, like if it's a news piece you're really interested in, you should read it carefully. Make sure it's citing some actual studies and not just opinions by other people, even if these people are like the top scientists in the world. So, and if you do that, I think there's kind of astonishingly little good evidence on a lot of things that we read. So yeah, that's kind of my one answer. Yeah.
I'll go. Henry, if you would like to go.
Yeah, sure. One thing that I'm particularly cognizant of after watching the first little bits of that awful Mikovits video that went viral, and we spent untold amounts of time trying to deal with. You want to look at the tone as well of whatever piece you're reading. Is it emotionally charged? Is it sensationalized? Is it using, like we heard about the sun's going to a minimum, we're all going to die. I mean, is this tone realistic? Is it playing to your own emotions? And is it trying to drive your sympathies for the victim? In this case, victim. I'm going to put that in big quotes. In this case, a scientist who claims to have been railroaded by the quote unquote scientific establishment. You want to look for that. I think you want to look for that emotionally charged verbiage. And anytime you start to see that, your index of suspicion should go way up in that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that the length of the piece for me is really important. So, I mean, like, I forget who mentioned it. I think Ted had said you go from a research report to a news article to a tweet that's 140 characters. And you can lose a lot of the perspective when you do that. And so I tried, when I'm reading science, and I like to read a lot of science news, I'm trying to look for like more long form articles, even though they take longer to get through. So to kind of round that with publications, I think like journals like The Atlantic, Wired Magazine, Undark are three awesome places, I think, for very good vetted science writing. Most of their articles, though, are in the thousands of words, but they tend to be written by well-established writers who are interviewing experts to talk and interpret about the science. And so I find that perspective to be really helpful. I read a lot of science that I don't understand, and I do science every day. So having someone that is in that field kind of say like, hey, this is the real nuts and bolts, and this is why it's important, helps me filter some of that out. And so you just don't see that in a CNN or a Fox News, or sometimes even an NPR article, which I like NPR a bit. But I also like to put my trust in some of the writers that are very established. Ed Young, who writes a lot, Carl Zimmer and Sarah Zhang are three examples of people that I think only Sarah has a bachelor's of science, and none of them are PhDs, but they all really understand what they're writing about. And a lot of it is just through interviewing the other experts in the field and kind of putting together a narrative about that. And I try and look for that narrative a little bit to help explain both the good and the bad of what it is they're reporting on.
Yeah, Wired is a good example of a layperson journal that seems to be fairly accurate. There are also journals associated with scientific professions like Physics Today, and then there's one that Society for Conservation Biology does, and there's various I guess journals like that that are intended for a degree somewhere between the lay audience. Some of them are for a lay audience, like Scientific American. Some of them are more for people who work in a particular field. Ecology is one I'm most familiar with, but aren't necessarily familiar with all the very specialized things like study of a particular insect or something like that. So they're written in more general terms that way. And those are fairly reliable. The reporters know they're scientifically trained. They have a science background or science degree, and and then you can go to find out if it's something that you're working on. Of course, you're going to look at papers in peer-reviewed journals. But one thing I definitely want to advise about is beware science news post on advocacy sites. So I would trust a vaccine study published on Lancet a lot more than one published on JennyMcCarthy.com. So yeah, so check your source. Some are more reliable than others.
Yeah, peer-reviewed sources, I guess. Lancet is peer-reviewed, and the other one is not.
Lancet is peer-reviewed. JennyMcCarthy.com probably is not. I haven't actually looked at it.
Yeah. Something I would also point out is in terms of news articles in the popular media, did the reporter interview people who were not involved with the study, which will typically be indicated so-and-so not involved with the study, to get an outside but expert point of view. Press releases are good, but they're obviously going to spin it from the point of view of the institution and so forth. And if the reporter is willing to fact check with other experts, that's a good sign.
Huge. I totally second that.
Yep. Go ahead.
I think it's kind of important to remember that every press release for research is intended to publicize this research. So I think very often, for very legitimate reasons, but they give disproportionately high value to this one piece of research, which tomorrow may prove not to be that important. So my suggestion, my favorite sources for an overview of the field are still Science and Nature, because in addition to papers, which are the highest impact in the field, they also publish editorial roundups, and their editors really know their job. So that's kind of
some of them are great reporting.
Yeah, right. So I mean, they combine this solid scientific knowledge and the ability to write them for general public. So yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that also shows the importance of scientists to be willing to communicate their work with the public, be willing to talk to reporters if the reporter is interested, and give them something in writing that they can draw from to make sure that it's accurate. And if it's not a skill that you have, PR departments in your universities or your organization can certainly put that together. In fact, they might be doing that anyway.
Well, I kind of have to add to that, because universities don't want scientists to talk directly to reporters. I've been approached by reporters recently, and our media office said that, don't. So they're really worried about what you will say that will be attributed to the opinion of the university. So if you do that, you go through your media relations office, and very often it doesn't end up being the most insightful or exciting interview. So so it's kind of it's a double-edged sword, and I think universities do it for good reasons. But
the stereotype of the scientist portrayed in Independence Day, the wild hair and as you can imagine, they don't let us out much. It's not. There is truth to that kernel, but it is also something something we need to be aware of. In terms of how we talk to the public, that we can sometimes come off like that.
Yeah.
Yep. Now I know
the jargon.
Yeah. In fact, Science and Nature and many journals have the commentary section, news and views. Depending upon the journal, it's called something different. Which I once saw described. Its function was to translate the hyper jargon of the actual research to mere generic scientific jargon that other scientists would appreciate. I noticed that there's a great question by Zhenyu Li that also duplicates one in the charge. which is with regards to looking at the literature, what can we do to improve giving people full access to the papers? Because sometimes when we want to read, the bulk of it are behind a paywall. And I'll start, my answer to it is, as your mileage may vary, normally the article will have a link that has the email address of the primary contact.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists want you to read their work. If you email us, we will send you a PDF. In general, at least in my field, now it may vary for other fields, but we like people to have access to our papers, and we will send you a PDF. But if anyone else has a different idea or additional ideas, I'd like to hear them. Ted's got an idea.
Yeah, that's the obvious one, to be willing to share your paper, although sometimes you're not allowed to by the publisher. But I think usually you can share the preprint. Usually, not always, but usually. We as scientists have that same issue sometimes, where we can't always access things behind paywalls. So, but hopefully our institutions have subscriptions and can get them. And then also you can get them if you're affiliated with the university library. If you're in a university system, it's not really a big deal. What would be nice would be that if public libraries could have that same kind of access, which I don't think is the case, but I think that that is something that needs to be negotiated with the publishers so that people can access information. Otherwise, if it's just sitting behind a paywall, sure, the publisher has to make money, but to survive, but that information's not doing anyone any good if no one can read it.
Right. So, I think just two quick thoughts. One also is, I know for almost all journals right now, anything related to COVID is completely open access. So papers, commentary, especially with like the Lancet, Science, News, Journal of American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, very high caliber, still not immune to bad research and reproducible problems. That's all open access right now. And the other one is that there are several journals now that their working model is completely open access. So PLOS One and the PLOS family of journals, everything there is always and always will be open access. And generally, there's a lot of good science in those journals that you can write about or read about that is related to what you're looking at. And Frontiers is kind of up and coming now. They have some issues that they are still sorting out with replication, but they're an open access journal as well.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
So there's a new kind of a rule, which is at least a decade old, that any research that is funded by any federal sources have to be open access. So all of us, in addition to publishing our papers anywhere else, will have to deposit them into an NIH database, and that's open access. So it's not always the final like typeset version of the paper. Sometimes it's a preprint, but that's a policy. So if we don't do that, we'll lose our NIH funding. So there's also a very big push in the community to make all the research open access to everyone. So actually there is a big push against journals that charge for subscriptions. And very often scientists pay publication fees, and then they will still charge for subscriptions. So I know that the University of California as a whole recently refused to subscribe to Elsevier journals. As a result, like I've had some scientists from UC system ask me for reprints, but it's a war that I think the universities will win eventually, because scientific research is supposed to be open to everyone to read. And all these preprint services and public depositories are in on it. And I think in Europe, there's also very big, so they're refusing, kind of boycotting all the journals that charge fees. And unfortunately, Science and Nature are also on the chopping block. So nobody knows exactly what will happen, but you should be able to read work that you're interested in. And if everything else fails, totally email us. We'll love to share.
So that means some other pay model will have to be developed for the many journals that are published by publishers like Springer or Elsevier that charge to charge readers because it costs money to put those things out, and it costs there's a lot of infrastructure and all that. So how is that paid for? Is it done publicly? Does that mean that governments will have the ability to censor scientific information? I can certainly think of a lot of governments, the U.S. included, that have censored scientific information in the past. So how do we make that? How do we support that and make it objective and neutral?
Yep. Sandy, I saw you had your hand up. So
yeah, I was going to Anna took most of what I was going to say, so thank you. But the website in question is PubMed Central, PubMed, and I posted a link to it in chat. So people who go there, you can find tons and tons of unpaywalled material from US funded researchers and anything that's unpaywalled global wide. So if you need to go to the primary literature, that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So I see we've come up on the 5-minute mark. So I'd like to ask the panelists to do their wrap-up point. You can also plug where you can be found in social media or elsewhere if you want. So let's do this alphabetically backwards by last name. So Ted, last major thoughts here on the topic. Obviously, this is too short a time to explore.
Yes. Ted Weber. I work as an ecologist. It's very hard to distill everything down into 1 minute, but for God's sake, read beyond the title before you share anything. Look for the source, see if they're biased. Look for peer-reviewed journals if you can. Beware science information published on advocacy sites. Do your research and think critically. So again, I work for Defenders of Wildlife. We're a nonprofit that seeks to protect wildlife and their habitats around North America. The first 2 books of my near future cyberpunk trilogy, Sleep State Interrupt and Wrath of Leviathan, are available on online outlets, and the finale will be released on September 1st. And you can find me on my website, tcweber.com, and my social media links are there.
Great. Anna.
Yeah, so I just posted my links to my website, which mostly features my fantasy novels, and I posted my 2 Twitter handles. One I use as a writer, the other one I use as a scientist. I don't keep up with social media very well, so if you Google my name, you will also come up on my University of Pennsylvania credentials. So yeah, I love to hear from people. Please feel free to contact me on any of these outlets. And yeah, I think my words to the people listening and reading all the science right now. So don't get overwhelmed and pick what you want. So you have to, like, if you're interested in a piece of information, you need to read it in depth, but yeah, don't take everything out there at face value. I think a lot of what they're saying right now about coronavirus will prove to be untrue. So I think yeah, I'm like totally about this aerosol transmission and contact transmission and things like this. So I think yeah, we are. Actually, there are many ways this pandemics could end, and I think yeah, social media is totally off right now. How it's going to happen? So, yeah.
Great. So Sandy.
Yeah, I second all the other points people have made. Pay attention to the tone of whatever it is that you're reading. If it makes you feel anxious or worried, or there are plenty of things that should do that, but if it's really driving you to go, oh my God, we're all going to die, it's probably, scientists are generally very cautious in the way we communicate. And the other thing that scientists aren't necessarily going to do is, in their scientific writing, they're not going to always take policy positions. Our job is to report facts, it's to report data, it's to report information. It's not to advocate for a particular position. That's someone else, really, it's someone else's job, to be clear. But we provide the supporting information for that. So yeah, be cautious, be careful, be patient. And that's very hard. And for scientists, sympathize with your readers, because we are all drowning in this stuff now. So that's it for me. So thank you.
Okay, Doug.
Yeah, thank you all for your awesome questions, and being on a panel with such awesome people has been really great. So I appreciate that. I second everything that they said about being cautious and keeping open-minded. Science publishing is a process. So in a couple of years, there might be new results that refute something that was bona fide a couple of years ago. I mean, it was just, revolutions in science occur all the time. So part of the scientific method is we need to go back and rethink what we once thought was completely true. And so that sometimes I think allows people to try and manipulate that message a little bit for whatever purpose they have. But yeah, I love talking about this stuff. And you can find me on Twitter at ripplesintime24. Message me or whatever. I'm happy to talk about it. And the only other plug I have is at 5 today, I'm giving an hour-long talk about the microbiome and space and on yourself and in your body. So if you're interested about bugs and bacteria and viruses, there might be some going around right now. Stop on by.
Great. And see me at the Dinosaur Update, the annual Dinosaur Update tomorrow at 1. Also, I want to thank all the panelists for being here. I want to thank the attendees for asking such great questions. There were a bunch of questions we weren't able to get to, some specifically about the so-called replication crisis, or that's the name of it. It's definitely a serious issue. I want to see maybe a future panel on that issue, because I don't think it'll be gone by next year. And we'll be willing to answer questions of some of us as for a few minutes after the main event is shut down. Also, on Discord, some people will be there available to answer questions, and this would be in the Science and Skeptics channel on Discord. So it looks like we are probably bumping up against the actual time. There we go. So our pictures are now moved over, but thank you for showing up. And if anyone wants to actually mention, answer one of the questions that didn't get answered here. There's what magazines do you have problems with? The way they spin articles. That's an interesting one. Also, if anyone has anything briefly to say about the replication crisis, that would be great.
Yeah, in terms of the replication crisis, there's a lot of stuff that's not published that has to be done. Yeah. Graduate students are not going to waste time building on someone else's work if they can't replicate it. So a lot of them are going to try that in their labs, in their hands. You just won't ever hear about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I speak from experience.
Yeah.
In ecology, there actually is quite a bit of replication in a sense, in that people will look at questions that are related, or they'll look at, say, a bird study in their particular area, whether it be the Northeast US or whether it be South America or wherever. When you get enough of these together, you can sort of develop general principles from that. So it's not quite complete replication, but it's similar studies using similar methods. There are accepted methods in ecology, but they're in different places and looking at slightly different questions, but could be comparable in some ways. That again is the value of meta-analyses that look at a bunch of different studies and try to draw out common themes.
I put a link in the chat for a paper that just came out like 3 days ago, basically where they took 70 different independent research teams with the same data set on functional MRI and analyzed it and compiled what were the results from all 70 different analyses based off of their own protocols, those kind of things. And it's pretty astounding that you can have varied answers looking at the same data and just using the biases and or just the assumptions of different types of ways you can analyze data. I think this article is paywalled, so I have hopefully not put you in front of a dead end. But again, they had the link right there. You can email Dr. Tom Schoenberg, and I would imagine that they will definitely share the article with you if you wanted to read it. Or send a message, and maybe you'll find it in your inbox. So I'm not opposed to that either. So
great. Yeah, I noticed.
I apologize. I had internet blink, so I was out now. I'm back.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, see, John Lackner asked a great question. It's too far. isn't the fact that so many people have no concept of critical thinking a major problem with the sensationalist article? How can we overcome that? Well, that is the work of a generation to educate people on critical thinking. I think that's specifically it, education, whether it is formal education in schooling or informal education, like doing scientific outreach like this. But yes, obviously, getting critical thinking as the standard for humans would be the main goal, and to help counteract sensationalism and so forth.
And thank you very much, panelists and attendees, but we do have a hard stop that we must go with. Everyone enjoy the rest of your virtual Balticon.
Bye-bye.
Great. Take
Bye.
care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tom.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Henry, thanks.